can still see some light, but not, or you can turn them down. That's, yeah, like that. That's good.
This ice cup. Okay, Jackson, come on. Let the men do their thing.
Of all of our thoughts and on, that is the only
Come on.
documentary evidence to my knowledge. Okay? Outline that.
How are you doing today, Johnny?
How am I doing today? I'm doing just absolutely unbelievably well today, sir, and you?
So great I can hardly stand it.
That is good, that is good.
Okay, this is just that. Let's see, so you're gonna sit over here. Oh, okay. Let me get a chair. Let me get that chair and sit over here.
Did you go back through makeup? Did you?
No, I haven't been through makeup.
Jack's, where's makeup?
Well, Mayor, you'll have to come here at some point, right?
I don't know where you can get her in there or not. I expect you prefer to play with those two babies.
Probably so, let's see here. Well, I won't let y'all worry about seeing anything like that. Alright. I hope that.
Tell you one thing,
Huh.
it's $10,000 an hour. I tell you, it's very valuable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which one of you? You sound like Elizabeth, barking like a dog.
Okay, I think we have enough audio. You're being recorded.
Okay.
So, I didn't know what subjects you had picked out. I can probably take this off now though.
I thought you had an outline.
Yeah, I thought you were going
I thought you had an outline. You just told us to be here. You just suited up and showed up.
Well, I'll tell you, between Hugheses, if you can't figure out something to talk about.
Well, I guess the most important thing is to let people know who we are
Well,
and why we're here.
on the right, we have the Honorable Brigadier General Robert Hughes, retired. And on the left, we have Johnny Hughes, otherwise known as John G. Hughes III, who's my father. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some things which we talk about, so 50 or 75 years down the road, instead of looking on the internet to see who our ancestors were, they'll be able to pull out this tape if we can keep it in the right spot and keep our tape from turning off. Let me check one thing. That was it. Let's see what tape we have in here.
This is a practice session.
This is. It really is, huh?
He's gonna cut and edit.
Be more on the cutting floor than it'll be on the reel.
Yeah, when he sees one of our profiles that doesn't look good, he can cut that out.
Yeah.
He promised he'd do that. He's gonna put a little hair on both of us.
I guess the trick is you have to record at the same time. Which we can do that. We can most certainly do that, so what I'll do is just record. So now we're recording, so we just went through the same thing. We have Robert Hughes on the right and Johnny Hughes on the left. So we've been talking about genealogy lately. And we've been looking all over the internet trying to find out who our ancestors are and were, and what have we found out so far.
Well, I am the sixth child and the third son of John Gilchrist Hughes Sr. I've had my 83rd birthday, and all of my siblings have passed on. We have found that John M. Hughes, my great-great-grandfather, was born in 1870, in 1790, and died in 1870. We know that he married Effie Gilchrist, and we've been trying to find out who John M. Hughes' father is, and we have been unable to determine. We know that his mother was named Margaret, and that John M. managed her estate in 1834. And maybe Johnny knows a little more about what we've been searching.
And here is the umpteenth generation. This is the namesake of Robert Hughes. This is little Robert Hughes. And my wife, Victoria Lynn Messina Hughes. And Robert has just turned, how many months? 14 months?
14?
He's 14 months. He's named Robert Anthony Hughes. He's Robert A. Hughes. We did change the Archibald to stick with the new century, although Archibald is still a hip name. We did put Anthony in there to show some of Vicky's Italian roots. And Vicky, you're more than happy to sit down and join the conversation if you want, because this is a Hughes family conversation. A Hughes hour of...
I'll see it in the theater.
And you are definitely a member of the Hughes family, not only by virtue of marriage, but also by virtue of production.
Yes.
Which is true, which is true.
I have
Which is true.
Hughes.
She has produced the 5th John Gilchrist
Yes.
and I was the 3rd John Gilchrist Hughes.
I helped
And
ever
the
since
guy
I...
that is holding the camera was the 4th John Gilchrist Hughes. And while we're here, I'm going to tell this story. I think the proudest day in my father's life was the day that Jack, the camera holder, was born. And of course, I had to name him John the 4th. And back several years ago, before he was married, he was up in Maryland, and I traveled that area and used to go by and have lunch with him on occasions. And we went out and had lunch one day, and we came back, and we were standing in the parking lot talking. And he looked at me and he said, "Daddy, if I ever have a son, have I got to name him John the 5th?" I said, "No." I said, "You can name him anything you want to." So anyway, when Vicky found out she was pregnant and it was going to be a boy, they were going to name him after Uncle Robert, which I thought was great, because Uncle Robert had done so much for Jack and Vicky. And, they brought a little portfolio around Uncle Robert, showing him the ultrasound with the Twinkie, and told him they're going to name him after Uncle Robert. He said, said, "You're going to name him after my father." And so that's the reason John the 5th is here. So we'll see how many more get here. And he said he'd rather have him named after his father than named after him. And really, the documentation that we have put together, basically Uncle Robert and Richard, and Carolyn, Uncle Robert's daughter, Mary Neal. We had much of the documentation done from a book called The Lumber River Scots that was commissioned by a governor, or former governor, or ex-governor at that time, Angus McLean. And it picked up the Gilchrist side of the family. And that's where we know that John M. Married Effie Gilchrist. And they are both buried at the Center Church Cemetery. And that's where the line stopped. We knew that John M. existed and Effie existed, who was the mother and father of Daniel Hughes, who was the mother and father of John Hughes, who was the mother and father of Robert Hughes. That's right, isn't it, Uncle Robert? I've got that right.
So far,
All right,
you're doing
okay.
all right.
And so then we started trying to find this Daniel Hughes. And of course, since the advent of the internet and everything else, we have tried to run down Daniel Hughes's, the archives of the Latter-day Saints. The Mormons was opened up to the public back some time ago. And if you search in there for a Daniel Hughes, we don't find any that would even come close, or even a John M. Hughes. We can't find in that library, but we have found enough to reasonably determine that John M.'s father was named Daniel, and as Uncle Robert said, his mother was named Margaret. And so the search will continue. Uncle Robert mentioned something about a cemetery that we're going to try to find over near Center Church and within sight of the Center Church, which is located between Red Springs and Maxton. And that was the site of the first Presbyterian college in the country as well. A rather old historic church. So from there, we came from the Center Church area, or Maxton-Laurinburg area, to Dr. Daniel moved to close to Dundas. No, not Shannon. Close to Shannon, which is just the side of Red Springs. And then Robert's father and my grandfather moved to Parkton. It was sometime around the early 1890s, wasn't it?
Well, we're not quite sure when Daniel got to Parkton. We know that J.G. Sr. came to Parkton in the 1890s. And we know that Daniel was not in Parkton in 1901 when the Parkton Presbyterian church was formed, because he was not a charter member, but later was an elder. So we must assume that he moved to Parkton after 1901.
And the reason Parkton is here is because sometime in the 1800s, the Atlantic coastline decided they were going to extend the main line from Rocky Mountain to Florence, South Carolina. And just west of Parkton, about maybe a mile and a half, was a railroad called the Cape Fear and Yadkin Valley Railroad, which intersected with a very famous road called the Plank Road. And the Plank Road was an old stagecoach route that was actually trees sawn in half, and so they wouldn't have to run into the mud, and laid down and give a firm service to the wagons and stagecoaches and whatever ride on. And that intersected at a place called McNatt Station, which is just maybe a mile west of where we're sitting now. And when they decided to extend the railroad on from Rocky Mountain to Florence, they swung the railroad into the main line here in Parkton. They just took a 90-degree turn almost and brought the track in here. And a Mr. McMillan went over to Shannon and talked to my grandfather, Robert's father, John G. Sr., and asked him to come over to Parkton and open up a store, since this looked like this might be a thriving place. At that time, it was called Piney Forest. Not much of anything was here other than just, basically nothing. The railroad was a mile west, McNatt Station was a mile west, and so this was just a farming area. And, before Parkton, according to, Mrs. Curry, who was the wife of Dr. Curry, who was the, town doctor for 100 years, he, came to town, I don't know, sometime in the early 1900s, and we had a celebration sometime in the 50s for him, that he, as a country doctor, delivered over 5,000 babies. But he married
Mabel Johnson.
And her old home place is about a mile west of town, close to McNatt Station. And before Parkton and Piney Forest, the area was known as Briar Level. And it was out near the intersection of 71 and 301. And the reason it was called Briar Level is there was a store sitting right in the middle of the briar patch. And this evidently was in the first days. And the reason they put it in there was because it was only one way to get to the store, and that was down this road through the briar patch, and the Indians couldn't sneak in. Now that's the story. But she had, Ms. Curry had some letters that were addressed to some of her forefathers and kin people. And it was addressed to Briar Level, to them at Briar Level, New Country. And which pretty well substantiated that Briar Level did exist before Piney Forest and then now Parkton. Anyway, Granddaddy Hughes came here to open the store. And he slept upstairs over the store and boarded out at I.J. Langston's. He would go out and walk about half a mile for his meals and slept upstairs over the store. And the store was located where Horace Parnell has his store now. And 100 years from now, probably nobody will know who Horace Parnell's store is. But at the corner of his store, one of the marks on the old town map is the beginning mark. Or was it the center of the railroad?
Center Railroad, but it would be right in front. The starting point of the town is the center of the railroad in front of Horace's store.
So the store would be located on the east side of the railroad, on the south side of on the north side of what is now Highway 71, right on that corner. It was a log cabin store, as I had been told.
Keep talking.
And at that time, most of the stuff was bartered. Granddaddy Hughes would take maybe 2 dozen eggs from some local farmer and trade them for something. And it was told to me by a gentleman who was quite a yarn spinner, Ed Phillips, that he'd take chickens and everything else, and then the people on the railroad would come through and he would sell them to the people on the railroad to generate some money.
Well, let's talk about, you've both been in this house for a while. Uncle Robert was born here.
No, the house was built while I learned to walk in this house. I don't know how else to put it. But I was born March 24th, 1918. And as I understand it, we were not living in this house at the time. But I learned to walk at 9 months of age, and I would learn to walk in the front hall. So I've been here practically all my life.
What was on this lot before the house was built?
Well, my father built a house closer to Washington Street, which would be east of where this house is now standing, between where the house is now standing and Washington Street. And that was the J.G. Hughes residence. And all the children, including myself, all 6, were born in that house. This house was started prior to World War I, but the construction was held up due to the war because of labor and materials, and was not completed until the war was practically over.
Was there electricity in the house when it was first built?
Yes, this house at the time of its construction was wired. They had what they called a Delco plant. It was a home generator in the backyard. It furnished power, lights only.
And what time would those lights be turned off?
Well, whenever someone's slowly inclined to go out and start the generator or cut it off.
What extent of water did you have?
The water was, my father went into an agreement with a neighbor across 3rd Street, a man by the name of J.B. McCormick. And the only way you could have water in those days was by gravity. So it was necessary to build a tank on pedestals. So my father and Mr. McCormick went in partnerships, and they put down a pump and a 1-cylinder gasoline motor to pump the water into a big tank. It was located on Mr. McCormick's property. We had water for bathing and washing, but the only water that we could drink or use to cook came from a hand pump on the back porch.
Which room was yours as a boy?
As a boy, I didn't move upstairs until I was a teenager. I really didn't have a room. I slept in the same room with my mother.
And so finally, when you graduated, you went to a room upstairs. Which room was that?
The one that we have Carolyn's dolls in at the present time.
Which was the kitchen in your later years.
Yeah, when Mary Neal and I were married and renovated upstairs as an apartment, we used that same room as a kitchen.
What was the biggest thing, Johnny, as a child you remember about coming over here?
That's neat. A lot of things, but the biggest thing I reckon I can remember is the big wooden box full of wooden blocks that Granddaddy Hughes would bring from the sawmill at Tobermory. And this is what they would burn in the fireplaces. And I can remember getting in that box with all these little short pieces of wood and throwing them out and then throwing them back in. And it irritated everybody except Granddaddy Hughes. And he would say, let the boy play. And a while ago you asked a question about this house, and maybe you ought to go back and take a picture of the house where Lolly is and the house across the street, because those two houses were the house that was originally on this lot, and they were basically cut in two, and one of them moved across Highway 71, and then one of them is immediately behind this house. And I reckon I can remember the kitchen. Back in the kitchen, there was a tremendous coal-fired or wood-fired cook stove. And one of the stories is that when Granddaddy Hughes married Miss Sally, which was Robert's mother, she was the dietitian over at Fort McDonald College. And of course, times had progressed and everything else, and sometime after they had been married, Miss Sally wanted an electric stove, and electric stoves became available. Well, Beulah, who was the gracious black lady that cooked here for 100 years, said she didn't want an electric stove because she didn't know how to work one of them things. So the story is that, of course, Miss Sally prevailed, and the electric stove came in, and the wooden stove and or the coal stove went. And along with it went Beulah. And the story is that Granddaddy goes down to see Beulah about what happened. Here's John V. And Granddaddy went down to see Beulah, and asked her what happened. She said, well, Mr. Hughes said, I told you that I couldn't cook on one of those things. And there's no need for me to even try. So anyway, I can remember when that kitchen was renovated, that wooden stove was in there, and that electric stove were both in there. And so the electric stove and the wood stove made it in the kitchen, and Beulah came back.
So there was a battle as today, gas to electric, wood to electric back in the good old days.
Well, no, you can imagine somebody, we're talking about before, I'd say maybe 1920, someone that had never even seen an electric light bulb. My father made the statement that my father was Robert's younger brother, who was born in 1911.
Older.
Yeah, older brother. That's right. And my father was born in 1911, and he said that when they moved in this house and they had the electric light, he said he stayed up all night long watching that bulb burn because he had never seen it. And so naturally Beulah, no one was familiar with electricity or anything else, and she was probably as scared of it as anything else. I mean, here's a woman been cooking for years. I remember she used to fry chicken in a wash pot out in the backyard. She'd go out and clean out a great old big cast iron wash pot, and best fried chicken you'd ever put in your mouth. And they had a smokehouse out in the back. And one thing I can remember is the time David Jr. David Jr. is my cousin, who was the son of Murtis, who was Robert's younger sister. They lived in Greenville. David Jr. was a year younger than I was. They used to come down here all the time. David Jr. and I played a great deal, and one time we hung a litter of cats. I can remember that.
We might have to edit that out if the
No, but that's part of the history now.
One thing we got to go back and clarify. John's mother, John M. Hughes, my great-grandfather's mother, was listed as head of the household in the 1810 census. So we have to assume that in 1810 that John's father had already passed away. And we've got to go back to the 1900 census to see if we can find John's father, who we still think was a Daniel Hughes. Just had to put that in there.
And for the record, we have seen where a John Hughes in 1763 or 53 paid taxes in Anson County. We did see a tax document that a John Hughes did pay that. So that leads to believe that there is a slim chance that maybe John M. Hughes's grandfather was John Hughes. We have contradicting stories, but that is an option too. I want to ask a question. I know, Johnny, you don't remember the Depression as well, but I've heard stories from Uncle Robert about the Depression. And I can remember this year the technology stocks took a nosedive, and I was always kind of questioning Uncle Robert's financial tactics, and he's always been very conservative in his finances, and he's chosen some very secure, if not unaggressive. But it turns out that last year, out of 99% of the residents of Parkton, he was probably in the 1% that made money last year because he had no technology stocks. It was all in North Carolina mutual bonds. And it showed me that Uncle Robert was one of the most well-astute businessmen around. And I think Uncle Robert could probably shed some light on why that is. He's told me stories about some of the hardships during the Depression. What were some of the hardships during the Depression that still stand out, which you worry about could happen in the future?
Well, Parkton, as we had earlier talked about, was chartered in 1901, and sometime in the late teens, a bank of Parkton was formed, and John Gilchrist Hughes Sr. was the president. And I don't remember the exact date, but it was sometime, give or take, 26 or 27, 1926 or 27, that the bank broke. And I remember as a child, and I would have been 8, 9, or 10 years old at the time. The only thing I'd ever heard of breaking was a dam. And I went down to see the hole in the wall of the bank where the money ran out. And that was the beginning of the Depression in the Parkton area. And it wasn't Parkton alone. I am told that the National Bank of Lumberton was the only bank in Robertson County that was not affected by having to close its doors during that Depression in 28. The Depression really hit in 28, but there was forewarning of it before. And I can remember when the only people in the town of Parkton that had any cash or any possibility of getting their hands on any cash was the postmaster, who was paid by the federal government, and the railroad workers. They got a check or were paid in cash, whichever, on a regular basis. But the school teachers, the state employees that worked on the road or anywhere else, the county employees, all were paid off in scrip, which was simply a piece of paper saying that the county of Robertson or the state of North Carolina owed this particular person that had worked for them X number of dollars. So I've been very leery of living through another Depression, and I've been looking for it all these years and have missed it so far, thank goodness.
Which is a good thing. I remember you talking about, and this being clear, that the Hugheses never were involved in slavery. We really looked at any man who wanted to work for a day's wage. John Gilchrist Hughes Sr. was an employer who employed several people, and during the Depression there was no cash or coin to be paid. How did you actually pay the workers which continued to work for your father?
Well, my father, he ran a sawmill in a small town, the name of Tobermory, in Blading County. And I don't, of course, back during the Depression, I was too young to know the too much about how it evolved, but I can remember when he paid his hands in what they call poodles. It was a aluminum coin that was stamped good for merchandise at J.G. Hughes store. Of course, the reason he paid off each day in these coins was to eliminate the bookwork of charging. And every 2 weeks, these coins were turned in, and they received cash for the coins they still had. But during part of that depression, the store at Tobermore, my father raised hogs out on what we called the duty farm, and those hogs were slaughtered and salted down, and they were available for the mill hands if they needed them. He planted wheat and he carried it over to Rayford and had it ground into flour, and that flour was available. So he ran his own commissary, and in many cases he fed his workers whether they were working or not.
After a good hard day's work on the sawmill or the farms, they were hungry, and there wasn't much food to be bought, but your father
It provided.
had provided and go an extra step to make sure that there was food to be given to the people who worked for him.
And this was when it says sawmill, this was a
Sawmill and
rather,
plane.
rather large lumber operation, and that they, had a sawmill and sold dress lumber that went out with the truckload. The
Carloads.
and the rail carloads. The VNCS, Virginia and Carolina Southern Railroad, used to break off in Hope Mills and go down through Elizabethtown. Of course, they pulled up the tracks, but it went through St. Paul's and then went on down to Tobermore, and it shipped lower by rail. And probably back then, his employees were maybe 100 or more, because I know there was quite a few houses that the mill hands lived in. And of course, he grew a lot of watermelons as well. I have some old pictures somewhere of watermelon harvest.
That's one thing in Parkton. You see soybeans, corn, wheat, cotton, and tobacco. Why don't you see watermelons grown as much anymore?
Labor intensive. You couldn't raise watermelons. You couldn't get the type of labor necessary to harvest them now. Some of those watermelons weigh 50 pounds.
How many watermelons did you ever put on boxcars?
Well, you take about, depending on the size, a boxcar carried over 1,000, 1,100, 1,200.
Granddaddy Hughes even employed one particular man that did not do a thing in the world but look after his watermelons. And that was Mr. Dan McMillan. That was Harry McMillan's father. That lives down across from where Bill Proctor lives now. And that's all Mr. McMillan did was he took a particular type of sandy loam soil to produce a good watermelon. And you could not plant watermelons year after year because of diseases.
Every 7th year.
And so you had to rotate the crops, and so that's what Mr. Dan did, was constantly looking for land so they could plant next year's watermelon crop. And I can remember as a kid, the backyard here was full of watermelons that they might not be able to put on the boxcar, but they could sell to a truck. And they'd have them back in the backyard, and over at my house, which is next door, where you live in now, Jack, and they'd have maybe 1,000 or so watermelons just stacked up out in the backyard to sell to truckers when they came through.
A watermelon that you loaded in a boxcar had to be perfect in every respect.
Now, the government inspector, about every 10th watermelon, he had a set of scales with 2 arms on it like this that would hold a watermelon. And about every 10th watermelon that would come through there, he'd weigh it to make sure that they were all consistent.
And their shape, and of course, if it had any flaw whatsoever, it was rejected.
The skin was broken on it, so it might start rotting before it. Most of them went into Baltimore, to the markets up in Baltimore. And then a lot of them there were sold and shipped on up into New York. And I know Daddy raised watermelons for years after Granddaddy died, and he still shipped that same broker.
Yeah, it's,
And when that broker died, Daddy quit growing watermelons. Because everybody else, they'd reject cars and they'd get the cars up there and say they were half good and half bad and want to knock money off of them, because produce business is run by a bunch of cutthroats, you know. But when that broker died, Daddy quit growing watermelons.
you had to be bonded to ship a carload of watermelons. So that if the watermelon didn't bring the freight, that the railroad company would not be out without their freight. You'd have to divvy up. And on occasions, my father has had to pay the freight of a carload of watermelons that did not sell for enough money to pay the freight.
Your father was very determined and very productive and wanted to do the most productive thing at every given moment. You told me a story once of someone asking him if he could go out to the pond. What was that all about?
Well, that was Norman Bundles, a local resident in this area who had a small farm. And this was back during the time of we had what I would call mule farming. There were no tractors available. And we had a wet spring, and the grass was growing and just about to wrap everybody's crop up. And Norman told me that he went out and took his turn plow and borrowed off his cotton. So he threw the grass away from it, and then got his hoe and started to clean out his cotton, and said the grass was so bad he just got disgusted and threw his hoe down in the field and walked to Parkton. And he saw my daddy going into the post office, and he said, "Mr. Hughes," said, "would it be all right if I go out to the pond and fish?" And Papa looked at Norman straight in the eye and said, "Norman, if you haven't got anything else to do but fish, you go fish." And Norman said it got his goat so bad he went back home and cleaned out his cotton.
Well, on that note, we need to take a break here. I need to rewind some video so we can take a break here, and we'll start back in just a couple minutes. Not sure we'll be able to do that.